I was last in Syria in Aleppo as the city was liberated in December, and I will be returning to Syria next month to undertake the first research visit into my doctoral studies into Christian-Muslim relations in Syria. What I'm going to do this evening is to look at the situation of the conflict in Syria through the lens, if you like, of Christian-Muslim relations. And what I must stress is when I've been to Syria at my own expense, nobody's paid for me to go, and I've wiped out my savings in doing so, I have met with ordinary people across the board, Sunnis, Shias, Druze, Kurd, Christians of all denominations. So the context is really important, and very briefly a little bit of background context. Syria is at the crossroads of empires. Throughout its history, it's been a place where empires have been and gone. Just this list, the Syrian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Hellenistic Syria, all these different empires, all these different cultures have left their marks. Syria is a mixture of multiple cultures, and you see that when you go to the historical places where you have places with Aramaic and Greek and Syriac and Assyrian and Latin inscriptions on them. And then you get to the 20th century, and once again, I believe that what's happening now throughout the region is very much a consequence of 100 years post-Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot. But if you just look at that list briefly, right until 1963, Syria was under the domination of others. And that's really important to remember in the psyche of the Syrian people, that actually other powers have always used Syria as a place of conflict, used its resources, occupied it. So since 1963, when the Ba'ath Party came into power, that actually was an Arabist party, it was a secular party, it remains a secular party, and was intended to allow freedom of worship and freedom of religion. So all these different cultures have left their mark, very physically, through the centuries. And unfortunately, many of these ancient sites have been very badly damaged by extremists who want to see this history obliterated. Remember, of course, as well, that Syria was at the crossroads, a trade between, it was the start of the Silk Route, a trade between Arabia and the Gulf and Europe and China. These pictures are actually taken in 2015 in the souk in Damascus, where if you go to Damascus now, it's operating kind of normally, but there is huge pressure from the economy has utterly collapsed. Still occasionally, so-called rebel positions are firing missiles into the center of Damascus. And life is very, very tough for the people of Syria now, not just from the war, but economically as well. I want to talk about one terminology. When you use the term rebel in Syria, almost across the board with Syrians in Syria, they are deeply offended by that term. They say they are not rebels, they are terrorists. And when you use the term moderate rebels, they really snap at you. And people who've been at the hands, experienced the terror, brutality of life under the moderate rebels, they say there is no difference between them and the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists. So that's an important thing. So how is Syria made up? Well, of course, now it's very difficult to tell the different communities. But before the conflict, it was roughly this makeup. 74% Sunni, 13% other Muslims. And that includes the Alawites, the Ismaili, and the Shia. And, of course, one of the problems is that the Alawites are in control, have been since Hafez al-Assad, and the Sunni are the majority. Then you got 3% Druze, and the figures are very rough and very vague. I mean, it's been said that there were 10% to 15% Christians. But one thing unique about Syria is that they're not separated. They all live amongst each other. Wherever you go in Syria, to the towns and still in government-controlled areas, wherever you go, the mosques, the churches, side by side, communities living side by side and with each other and amongst each other. For years, pilgrim sites in Syria have been pilgrimage places for Christians and Muslims together. So these represents actually the ethnic composition. You can't probably see the details there, but the majority ethnic within those particular areas. There are very strong Christian communities in Damascus, in Homs, Aleppo, up in the northeast here, in Hazakeh. Really, It was Hezbollah fighters who were protecting the monastery and the Sunni Christian village. And the Sunnis in this village are actually helping the Christians. And when the village was taken back by the Syrian army, after the churches in the village were destroyed, the Sunni villagers have helped rebuild the churches in that village. Everywhere you go in Syria now, where I go to Syria, the faith communities are working desperately together. It's really, really hard because trust has been fractured to a huge degree. But the local faith leaders, the local Muslim leaders, the local Christian leaders are working together with their communities to look after the internally displaced, to look after the people who've lost their homes. Let us not forget that there are 6.9 million internally displaced people inside Syria, and they're all in government-controlled areas of Syria because that's where they're gone, they're being looked after by the communities, by the churches, by the Muslim communities, by the government, by the Syrian Red Crescent. And nobody's helping them. And then you have the diversity of the Islamic community as well. Sunni is the majority, just put the Omad Mosque there to represent that. And then there's some very important Shia shrines as well, particularly the Sayyida Zainab Mosque in Damascus on the bottom left there, which is the burial place of Zainab, daughter of Ali, who was granddaughter of Muhammad himself. And Shia Muslims come from all over the region to come on pilgrimage there. Daesh have said that they want to destroy this shrine, and there have been several car bombings at this shrine in the last couple of years. And I put the whirling dervish there because Sufism is also really important in the history of Syria and has marked the nature of Islam in Syria as well. The work of the reconciliation work between the faith communities is absolutely phenomenal. This photograph was taken at a meeting of faith leaders, Sunni, Shia, political leaders, government, opposition, fighters, in Homs, as bombs and gun battles were going on outside the building. And actually it was 2 weeks before the agreement was formed where the terrorists agreed to leave Homs and were taken away, and fighting stopped, and people were thankful. Now, Voices of Syria, I have a young friend, a young Christian girl. She showed me her house in Syria, and it was bombed, and I said, "Who bombed your house?" And she said, "The Syrian government bombed my house." But we said to the Syrian government, "No problem. If it takes bombing our house to get the terrorists away, do it." And I heard the same several months later from a Sunni young man from Homs who said exactly the same. We want the terrorists out. So what has happened in all these areas is that the terrorists have moved in, occupied certain areas, committed horrific crimes in those areas against Christians, Muslims, anybody who disagrees with them. Therefore, there's been huge fleeing, and the government has bombed those areas and tried to defeat the terrorists. I show this picture because this is Sheikh Mohammed. 2 weeks after this picture was taken, he went into a great risk. These church and faith leaders are doing this. He went into a moderate rebel-controlled area to negotiate a ceasefire and the laying down of arms, and as soon as he arrived, he was shot through the head. Much of Syria that has been under rebel occupation or terrorist occupation has been utterly devastated. But it has to be stressed, actually, that most of the refugees have fled before this has happened. And the stories that are coming out from those refugees is absolutely horrific. And if I had more time, I would share some of the actual voices of the stories. But beyond imagining what people have been through, and the scale of the killing at the hands of our so-called moderate rebels has been utter disgraceful. So you have faith communities working in devastated communities to try and help the communities among them. And this particular slide I showed was some relief coming to some of the internally displaced. And I just wanted to stress that point of the number of internally displaced is more than all the refugees outside Syria combined. And they are being looked after inside Syria by a whole range of local communities, even amidst the devastation caused by the sanctions and the lack of money. Then we go to Aleppo, and I'm going to share a bit of this. This was the scene in Syria on the day that I drove to Aleppo. It's a difficult drive still, because actually to go up to Aleppo, you go up to here, and you have to go into the desert and turn off here, where you're literally with Jabal Nusra on one side and Daesh, ISIS on the other. and that road is under threat of attack all the time. And it's a road that is littered with the remains of vehicles. But every day now there are buses that are plying that road. Remember, Aleppo is a city of 2 million people. 1.5 million people live in West Aleppo. It wasn't never a decided city. It was divided by the terrorists who came and occupied East Aleppo. But 1.5 million people live in the western part of Aleppo. Christians, Muslims, Shia, Kurds, Druze, together. And the other part of the city, which was occupied by the terrorists, we were told constantly for 4 months. Do you remember it? 300,000 people trapped, 250,000 trapped. Okay? Then when it was freed, silence. We've heard nothing more about it, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So we'll just get to Aleppo. The road to Aleppo is like this. And of course, the reason I take that is because these barrels are to prevent snipers from getting sniper positions to fire on the civilian vehicles that are trying to get, and the lorries as they're trying to get resources into Syria and food and so forth. And then you get into the city. Most of the city looks like that, or 2/3 of the city looks like that. Life goes on. People are living together. Churches and mosques side by side, cafes, schools. The trouble is, for the last 4 years, this part of the city has been bombed daily, shelled by rebels. Thousands of people have been killed, hospitals have been destroyed, schools, the university has been attacked several times. It's been non-stop. And in the last few months before Christmas, the rebels received more arms, hundreds of Grad missiles, which were falling on the West Aleppo on a daily basis. This was never reported because it wasn't the story you wanted to see. What the West wanted you to see was the government bombing of East Aleppo, where, of course, there were people trapped. So I was there on the last night as Aleppo was liberated. I have to say that I witnessed, this photograph was taken 2 floors lower than where I was watching all night as the last window of terrorist occupation was being bombed. It was a powerful, I was there to tears because it was a terrifying, terrifying night. And also we were getting fire coming in this way and shells coming in this way as well all night long. But the next day, the city went silent. It was announced that the city was free of terrorists. I was delighted to hear when I went to the refugee centre the next day that actually 13,000 people have been able to get out of this area that was bombed that night the day before, which certainly means most of the civilians were out, which I was pleased to hear. The next night, the city was it was a privilege to be there. Thousands and thousands of people out in the streets, all communities out together, setting off fireworks, cheering, setting off music, dancing in the streets. I got into a taxi. A man there was at the wheel, and he was sobbing his heart out. And he said, we said, shall we go away? He said, no, get in. He said, this is the third, they said, thank God, the killing will now stop. And he said, this is the third most important day of my life. The first was my marriage, the second, the birth of my children. This night, the liberation of my city, is the third most important day. Of course, it wasn't completely over then anyway. And then we went in, as areas of the city were being liberated, we went into those areas. What was very interesting was, and this is really important as well, the devastation is vast. But actually, most of the devastation is clearly ground to ground. There are areas which have been bombed. They're actually quite localized, and certain buildings. There you see a building which has been bombed. Okay, thank you. But actually, most of the city of East Aleppo there were factions, multiple terrorist factions fighting against each other, block by block, street by street. And of course, the Syrian army was going in, block by block, street by street, building by building. And you could see the devastation from shelling and so forth. And of course, certain areas were bombed as well. This is the ancient souk of Aleppo, which we were the first group. Actually, I was without army accompaniment, without government accompaniment, to go in. And the terrorists had actually burnt it a couple of years ago. Of course, the famous Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo, which they blew up the minaret, which was a unique 12th century minaret, which had been used as a terrorist centre and a sniper place as well. Now, what's happening in East Aleppo is that as areas are freed, they were immediately starting schools up. This was a school actually in a factory that had been mostly destroyed by the terrorists, and they immediately started up a school for young people. Now, this is very important. We went to the reception centre. In the weeks leading up to the final liberation of the city, 110,000 people went to this registration centre, where they were given food, we saw it, where they were given food, where they were given information about any services that they could access. They were given immediate care, health care. There were ambulances on hand to take anybody to hospital. There was a Russian field hospital there doing operations on site for those who needed it. And the refugees, they came and they wanted to tell their story. This is important, because without exception, they were saying several things. One, they were starving, by the way. The terrorists would kill, execute anybody who opposed their ideology. Two, they were told that anybody who opposed their ideology was kafir and therefore deserved to be killed. That was Muslim, Christian, whoever. Three, women, a number of women, quite a lot of women, were actually taken, raped. If they resisted, they were killed. Four, they stockpiled food, and food aid wasn't getting to the civilians in the city. It was being brought in by Turkey to terrorists. It was being stockpiled, and occasionally they would sell at exorbitant prices to the people. Five, medical aid. After the capture of the city, they found stockpiles of new medical equipment and facilities being stockpiled. We spoke to a man, I remember this picture here, a man who actually said, I begged the terrorists, that's their term, not mine, I begged the terrorists to give me medical aid for 4 years, not once did they give it. And he was waiting to be seen at the Russian field hospital. And they were cheering, saying, thank God, we are free. So the narrative, and there was not one media person present at this, and there hasn't been since. 110,000 people went to government-controlled areas. 14,000, that includes the fighters, chose to be bussed out, at the permission of the Syrian government, to other terrorist-controlled areas of the country. So this whole thing of, the international media narrative is grossly misrepresentative. And parts of it are lies. And I say, they can go, BBC can go into Syria, CNN can go into Syria, they've got reporters occasionally. Why haven't they been there? These people are there to tell their stories. Nobody's going to ask them, because their story does not match the story we have heard. And meanwhile, Mosul, it's the governments are fighting terrorists who are besieging their people, and the refugees are coming out and their stories are being told and all the terrible things the same people are doing to this refugees. So I spent several times, twice, I was in Aleppo in September and in Aleppo in December. And in September, I met with the faith leaders of the city. In England, I was told I received a lot of opposition in England from church leadership and political leadership to this engagement. And I was told, but your actions might damage Muslim relations. I showed them that picture there, because that's most of the Muslim leaders of the city. I won't go on to that slide. Where does hope lie? The last few minutes. Hope lies in people like this. These are young students at Damascus University, and they're students from the Department of Tourism. Their country has been torn apart, racked. And they say, we are going to stay, and when Syria is back at peace, when we recover, it's going to take a long time, we will be your guides, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Syria, and we want it to be pluralistic. People like Maria Saadeh, she was an MP in the Syrian government. She's Christian, she's young, she's PhD from France, studied in England as well. Dynamic, modern, absolutely everybody I've met. I met all the internal opposition leaders as well, all talking of the need for reform and so forth. But nobody in the West will talk to them. Why? because they're part of the Syrian government or because they're inside Syria. We don't want to talk to inside Syria. The voices of the people of Syria inside Syria are not being heard. They're being ignored. Of course there are different factions, of course there are different opinions, of course terrible things have happened on all sides. This little girl, I haven't got time to tell exactly what she said. Her father, 2 months before this photograph was taken, was killed in a fight trying to save the village that we were in, this Christian village. And she, she wrote a little poem about crying out for the diversity and the plurality of the country to be restored, and for the international community to stop supporting terrorists. And the words were, send the terrorists away from here. And finally, this particular church, this village, for 3 months fought off the moderate rebels who had gone into Malula, killed Christians, and desecrated the shrines. At one point, it was believed that they would actually win the battle. And all the men of this village went out and fought with the Syrian army to hold off the rebels. The women and the children and the older men went into the churches, and they made a promise. And the promise was twofold. One, now remember that actually in places where the rebels, our nice moderate rebels, go in and have attacked Christian communities, people have been beheaded on the spot. In the churches as they gathered, they made a promise. One, that they would not give up their faith whatever happened. And two, they would refuse to hate. And this was children as well. This was the scene in Damascus just before Christmas. In this restaurant here on the left, Muslims and Christians were having a Christmas dinner together. In a restaurant which 6 months ago, a shell fell into the middle of it and 23 diners were killed instantly. In 6 months, the restaurant has been restored and Damascenes are going in and having meals there once again. And Christians and Muslims celebrating Christmas out together. The people are crying out for that diversity to be restored, respected. And they say it is not up to any international person or any outside person to dictate who is going to lead us. We will decide who will lead us. And it's not up to any international rebel faction, terrorist, to take away our lives and our country. We want to be able to remake it. It will be a long, long, hard struggle. They know that. There's a lot of pain. There is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fracturedness amongst the communities. But in many of the people of all communities, there is a desire, and I believe a will actually, to try and restore some semblance of hope in the country. That hope will not come from the people that our Western governments